The first time Daniel Whitman laughed at Emily Carter's bakery, he did it in front of 12 customers, a display case full of warm honey rolls, and the one woman in Charleston who had already survived being underestimated by him once. The little brass bell above the door had barely stopped ringing when he stepped inside with Vanessa Blake on his arm, bringing with him the cold polish of downtown offices, expensive cologne, and the quiet arrogance of a man who believed every room still belonged to him. Emily was behind the counter, her sleeves rolled to her elbows, a faint dusting of flour on her wrists, sliding a tray of cinnamon pear pastries into the glass case, while the morning sun poured through the front windows in soft gold stripes. The golden crust was not much to look at from the street, at least not to someone like Daniel. It sat between a used bookstore and a dry cleaner on a shaded block just off King Street, with a hand-painted sign, 6 small tables, and a chalkboard menu that Rachel Morgan rewrote every morning in looping white letters. But at 7:30 on a Thursday, it smelled like butter, roasted apples, fresh coffee, and the kind of second chance no lawyer could take away. Emily felt him before she looked up. Some people enter a room gently. Daniel had always entered as if the air should rearrange itself around him. For one foolish second, her fingers tightened around the metal tongs, and the old version of her, the one who used to measure the temperature of his moods before speaking, stirred somewhere deep and tired inside her. Then the oven timer chimed behind her, sharp and ordinary, and it brought her back. This was her shop, her counter, her name on the business license. Her rent paid 3 days early. Her hands, still warm from shaping dough before dawn. Daniel glanced around as if inspecting a garage sale. Vanessa, glossy and perfectly dressed in a cream coat that probably cost more than Emily's mixer, leaned closer to him and whispered something that made him smile. He looked at the chalkboard, then at the line of customers holding paper cups and pastry bags, then finally at Emily's apron, where a small patch read owner in navy. Fred. His smile widened. So this is what you became after me, he said, not loudly enough to be called cruel by accident, but loudly enough for every person waiting by the register to hear. The room changed. A fork paused above a slice of almond cake. The retired teacher near the window lowered her coffee. Rachel froze beside the espresso machine, one hand still on the steam wand, her green eyes narrowing in a way that would have concerned a smarter man. Emily set the tongs down carefully. She could feel heat rising in her face, not from shame exactly, but from memory. Daniel had always known how to make humiliation sound like concern. During their marriage, he had called her practical when he meant small, supportive when he meant invisible, talented when he meant harmless. Back then, she had let those words settle over her like dust. Today, there was actual flour on her skin, and somehow it felt cleaner. Daniel took another step toward the counter, his polished shoes clicking against the worn tile floor. A bakery, he said, with a soft laugh. I have to admit, Emily, I expected something a little more ambitious after all that talk about starting over. Vanessa gave a polite little smile, the kind people use when they want to appear kind while enjoying someone else's discomfort. Emily looked past them for a moment, through the front window, where the delivery driver had just pulled away from the curb after dropping off 3 extra sacks of Carolina milled flour. 3 months ago, she could barely afford one. 2 weeks ago, a food blogger from Atlanta had posted a 30-second video of her honey sourdough being torn open by hand, steam curling into the camera, golden crust cracking like thin glass. Since then, online orders had filled her inbox faster than Rachel could print labels. Yesterday, Emily had received her 3rd meeting request from an investment group. That morning, before Daniel walked in dressed like a bad decision with cufflinks, 2 investors had left messages asking whether she would consider regional expansion before the holidays. Daniel did not know any of that. Men like Daniel rarely looked closely at what women built after they left. They only noticed whether it was large enough to threaten their memory of being important. Emily wiped her hands on a towel, lifted her chin, and gave him the same calm smile she gave customers who complained that real vanilla cost too much. Good morning, Daniel, she said. Would you like coffee, or did you only come in to review the square footage? A few people in line looked down quickly, hiding their smiles in paper cups. Rachel made a small choking sound that might have been a cough if civilization had not required lying. Daniel's expression flickered, just once. It was tiny, but Emily saw it. The old Daniel would have expected her to flinch. The new Emily had dough rising in the back, payroll due Friday, a commercial oven that needed replacing, and a folder under the register containing 3 offers from people who understood what he never had. The golden crust was not a hobby. It was the beginning of an empire, and it smelled like bread before sunrise. Daniel's mouth tightened at the small ripple of amusement that moved through the bakery, but he recovered quickly because men like him did not experience embarrassment so much as temporarily misplaced superiority. He gave Emily a thin smile and looked toward the pastry case as if the rows of golden croissants and glossy fruit tarts had personally offended him. "Coffee, then," he said. "Black. I assume that is still within the business model." Vanessa laughed softly beside him, and Rachel turned toward the espresso machine with the careful silence of a woman choosing civilization over several more satisfying options. Emily entered the order into the register, tapped the screen, and told him the total. Daniel blinked. "You are charging me?" "That is usually how stores work," Emily said. "Even the small ones." The retired teacher by the window hid another smile behind her mug. Daniel slid a credit card across the counter with 2 fingers, as if touching the place too directly might lower his tax bracket. Emily took it without letting their hands meet. The last time she had held one of Daniel's credit cards, she had been standing in the kitchen of their old house, listening to him explain that the account had been frozen because of a banking mistake. That was what he had called it then, a mistake. Later, during the divorce, she learned the mistake had included missed payments, hidden loans, and her signature placed beneath financial decisions she had never been allowed to question. For 3 years of marriage, she had believed she was helping him build something. In truth, she had been decorating the walls of a house with no foundation. Rachel set Daniel's coffee on the counter harder than necessary, though not hard enough to be rude in a way that could be proven. Emily placed a lid on it and turned back to the ovens. A fresh batch of honey sourdough needed scoring before it went in, and the dough waited for no man. Not even one who had once convinced half of Charleston that ambition looked exactly like his reflection. Daniel, however, had not finished performing. He lifted the cup, glanced at the chalkboard menu again, and said, "You know, I remember when you used to talk about opening something elegant. A real patisserie, maybe. Marble counters, downtown address, private clients. This is charming, I suppose." The pause before charming carried more insult than the word itself. Emily picked up the razor blade she used for scoring bread and drew a clean line across the first loaf. The motion was gentle, practiced, almost meditative. "I remember a lot of things I used to talk about," she said. Daniel leaned an elbow on the counter, lowering his voice just enough to pretend the conversation had become private while keeping it perfectly audible. "I am only saying, do not confuse survival with success." There it was. The old blade, polished smooth. Emily felt the words land somewhere familiar, somewhere scarred but no longer open. 5 years earlier, that sentence would have undone her. It would have followed her into the bathroom, into the mirror, into the quiet hours after midnight when she replayed every failure and wondered whether he had been right all along. But this morning, the bakery was warm. The ovens hummed. A little boy at table 3 had powdered sugar on his nose. A woman from the real estate office down the street was picking up 2 dozen breakfast buns for a staff meeting. Behind the register, beneath the cash drawer, sat a folder from Brooks and Vale Hospitality Ventures with a preliminary valuation that had made Rachel cry in the walk-in cooler because crying in front of flour sacks was apparently less embarrassing than crying near customers. Emily slid the tray into the oven and closed the door. "Survival is what people call it before they understand the numbers," she said. Daniel studied her then, really studied her, and for the first time since he had walked in, a small uncertainty crossed his face. It was not guilt. Daniel had never been naturally gifted in that area. It was calculation. He was trying to measure the distance between the woman he remembered and the one standing in front of him, and the math was not comforting him. Vanessa shifted beside him, her smile fading as she looked from Emily to the line of customers still forming behind them. The bell above the door rang again, and 2 college students stepped in, already asking whether the honey sourdough had sold out. Rachel answered before Emily could. "Not yet, but give it 10 minutes. Daniel looked at the students, then at the full tip jar, then at the stack of prepaid pickup orders clipped beside the register. For one brief, satisfying second, Emily watched him notice the bakery as something other than a punchline. Then his phone buzzed, saving him from the terrible burden of humility. He glanced at the screen, straightened his jacket, and lifted his coffee. "Well," he said, forcing the old smile back into place. "Good luck with all this." Emily met his eyes. "Thank you. We open at 6 tomorrow if you need another reminder." He left with Vanessa trailing beside him, the bell ringing sharply after them. Only when the door closed did the bakery breathe again. Rachel turned to Emily, eyebrows raised. "I deserve a medal for not saying what I was thinking." Emily reached for the next tray of dough, her pulse still uneven but steadying. "Put it on the company expense report," she said. Rachel laughed, and outside, Daniel paused on the sidewalk, staring back at the hand-painted sign as if it had just become a language he could not read. By noon, the line outside the Golden Crust had reached the neighboring dry cleaner, which made Mrs. Alvarez from the bookstore step out with a paperback in one hand and a look of theatrical betrayal on her face. "Emily Carter," she called through the open door. "Your bread is blocking my mystery readers." Emily laughed for the first time since Daniel had left, a small sound that surprised her with its own lightness. The morning rush had become a living thing. All ringing phones, warm paper bags, names written on cardboard cups, and Rachel moving behind the counter like a red-haired storm with an apron. The honey sourdough sold out in 26 minutes. The cinnamon pear pastries disappeared before 11. A young mother bought the last 2 lemon cream buns and apologized to the man behind her as if she had stolen medicine. Through it all, Emily worked with steady hands, but Daniel's words kept returning in flashes, not because they had wounded her the way they once would have, but because they had reminded her how long she had allowed him to stand between her and her own reflection. After the lunch crowd thinned, she carried a tray of cooling loaves to the back room, where the air was warmer, quieter, and thick with yeast and sugar. The back room was barely larger than a walk-in closet, with metal shelves, a scarred prep table, and a second-hand refrigerator that rattled like it had seen several presidencies and disapproved of all of them. Above the flour bins, taped to the wall, was the first menu she had ever written for the shop. 5 items, crooked letters, coffee stains on the corner. She had kept it there as proof that small beginnings were not the same as small dreams. Her phone buzzed on the prep table. Rachel picked it up before Emily could wipe her hands. "Unknown number," Rachel said, then squinted at the screen. "Actually, not unknown. It says Brooks and Vale Hospitality Ventures." Emily stilled. The room seemed to narrow around the humming refrigerator. "Let it go to voicemail," she said too quickly. Rachel stared at her. "Emily, I am covered in flour. Investors do not care. Half of them look like they were assembled in airports." The phone kept buzzing. Emily could feel her pulse in her fingertips. Money had a sound to her now, and it was not the clean ring of opportunity people imagined. It sounded like Daniel at their old dining room table, telling her not to worry about documents she did not understand. It sounded like lawyers using polite voices to explain why her contributions were not legally visible. It sounded like discovering that love, when placed in the wrong hands, could be itemized, leveraged, and dismissed. Rachel's expression softened. She set the phone down and let it ring out. A moment later, the voicemail notification appeared. Neither of them moved. Then Rachel said, gently, "You are allowed to be afraid of the door and still open it." Emily looked at the old menu on the wall. 5 items. Coffee stains. A dream written in chalk because she had not been able to afford a printed sign. She pressed play. A man's voice filled the room. Calm. Professional, not slick. "Ms. Carter, this is Nathan Brooks. I visited your bakery last week and again this morning. I would like to speak with you about growth capital, but only if you are interested in keeping creative and operational control. What you have built has unusual customer loyalty, and I believe it deserves protection before it deserves expansion." Emily listened without breathing. Not once did he call it cute. Not once did he call it a hobby. Not once did he speak as if he had found a lost woman waiting to be rescued by a man with a checkbook. Rachel's eyes widened. "Replay that last part." Emily did. Protection before expansion. The words settled over the room differently than Daniel's had. They did not shrink her. They gave shape to something she had been too tired to name. For years, Daniel had made success seem like a tower, tall, cold, and impossible to enter unless someone powerful handed you a key. But this place, with its cracked tile and stubborn refrigerator and customers who remembered her birthday, because Rachel had once written it on the chalkboard by accident, had taught her another version. Success could be warm. It could rise slowly. It could begin at 4:30 in the morning with aching feet and a bowl of dough. Emily picked up the phone, stared at the number, and for a long moment saw two futures. In one, she stayed safe and small because small could not be taken from her easily. In the other, she learned the language of contracts, ownership, valuation, and control, not because she trusted the world, but because she finally trusted herself enough to read every line. She called Nathan Brooks back before fear could talk her out of it. The call lasted 9 minutes, though later Emily would remember it as both shorter and longer, the way people remember moments that quietly divide their lives into before and after. Nathan Brooks did not begin with compliments. He began with questions. How many loaves could her current oven produce in a morning? What percentage of customers returned within 30 days? How many wholesale requests had she declined because she lacked staff? Did she own the honey sourdough recipe outright? And had she filed for trademark protection on the golden crust? Each question landed like a coin dropped into a jar she had not realized was filling. Emily answered slowly at first, standing in the back room with one hand on the prep table and flour drying along the lines of her fingers. Rachel hovered nearby, pretending to organize parchment paper while listening with the focus of an intelligence agency. Nathan's voice remained even, almost careful, as if he understood that numbers could be frightening when the last man who used them around her had used them as fog. I am not interested in changing what makes your bakery work, he said. I am interested in helping you scale it without letting someone else strip it for parts. Emily looked toward the front of the shop, where the afternoon light warmed the wooden tables and Mrs. Alvarez was arguing cheerfully with a college student over whether lemon cream buns counted as lunch. I have heard versions of that before, Emily said. The sentence came out quieter than she intended, but Nathan did not rush to fill the silence. That alone made him different. Daniel had always treated silence like an empty room he owned. Then do not trust the version, Nathan replied. Trust the documents after your attorney reads them. Emily almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because no man in her old life had ever encouraged her to bring a lawyer into a conversation. Daniel had once called attorneys unnecessary when things were going well and unavoidable when things were already ruined, which was convenient for him and expensive for everyone else. Nathan proposed a meeting the following Monday, not in a hotel bar or a private club, but at the bakery before opening, where Emily could show him the operation as it actually existed. He mentioned 2 other firms had been circling local food brands in the Southeast, and if they had noticed her growth curve, they would move quickly. You do not need to panic, he said, but you do need to prepare. After the call ended, Emily stood still long enough for the oven timer to beep twice before Rachel finally snatched up a towel and opened it herself. I am trying to respect your emotional processing, Rachel said, sliding a tray of seeded rolls onto the cooling rack. But the bread has no interest in your character development. Emily exhaled, and something inside her loosened. Not healed, not fully, because healing was not a light switch and life was not one of those cheerful posters people hung in break rooms to disguise fluorescent despair. But something loosened. She pulled the folder from beneath the register and spread the papers across the back table. There were emails, screenshots of sales numbers, order projections, supplier invoices, and 3 messages from people using phrases like brand acquisition and aggressive expansion. Words that sounded glamorous until you imagined strangers deciding that your grandmother's honey glaze would perform better if made cheaper in a warehouse outside Atlanta. Emily took out a blank legal pad and wrote 3 words at the top: ownership, control, protection. Rachel leaned over her shoulder. That is either a business plan or the start of a very polite revolution. Maybe both, Emily said. For the next hour, they worked between customers, adding columns of numbers, listing equipment needs, estimating staff hours, calculating how many square feet a second kitchen would require. Emily wrote down every question she had been too embarrassed to ask 6 years earlier. What is valuation? What does preferred equity mean? Who owns the recipes if the company expands? What happens if an investor wants to sell? Each question felt like reclaiming a piece of language Daniel had kept locked away from her under the label of complicated. By closing time, the bakery smelled of cooling sugar and dish soap, and Emily's feet ached from standing since 4:30 that morning. She turned the sign to closed, wiped the final streak of flour from the counter, and saw Daniel's coffee receipt still crumpled near the trash can where Vanessa must have dropped it. Rachel noticed her looking. "Want me to frame it?" Emily picked it up, folded it once, and threw it away. "No," she said. "We have actual paperwork now." Monday arrived before the sun had fully cleared the rooftops, with Charleston still wrapped in that pale blue hour when streets looked softer than they really were. Emily unlocked the golden crust at 4:15 in the morning, the key turning with its familiar stubborn catch, and for a moment she stood in the doorway breathing in the quiet. The shop smelled faintly of yesterday's sugar, lemon oil, and the deep yeasty warmth that had soaked into the walls no matter how many times she scrubbed them. Rachel was already inside, because Rachel considered punctuality a personal competition with the universe. She had tied her hair into a messy knot and was labeling trays with the seriousness of a surgeon. "You are early," Emily said, hanging her coat on the hook by the office door. "So are you," Rachel replied. "We are both emotionally unwell, but at least we are productive." Emily smiled, but her stomach was tight. Nathan Brooks was due at 5, a full hour before opening, and she had spent most of Sunday night reading articles about small business financing until the words equity, dilution, franchise model, and operating agreement began floating behind her eyelids like hostile alphabet soup. At 2 in the morning, she had finally closed her laptop, made tea, and pulled out the divorce binder she kept on the top shelf of her closet. She had not opened it in almost a year. Inside were old bank statements, court letters, settlement drafts, and the final decree that had once felt like both a prison release and a financial obituary. She had read through enough to remind herself what ignorance had cost. Not stupidity. She refused that word now. She had not been stupid. She had been trusting in a marriage where trust had been treated like a resource to extract. That was different. By 4:30, the first batch of dough was on the prep table. Emily pressed her palms into it, folding the soft weight over itself, letting the rhythm settle her breathing. Bread had never lied to her. If the room was too cold, it rose slowly. If she rushed it, the texture suffered. If she gave it time, warmth, and structure, it became something stronger than it looked. There was a lesson in that, though she would rather have learned it from a cookbook than from a failed marriage and a legal bill. At 5 exactly, the bell above the door rang. Nathan Brooks stepped in alone, wearing dark jeans, a navy jacket, and no visible performance of wealth. He carried a leather notebook instead of a flashy briefcase. His hair was silver at the temples, his expression attentive without being invasive. He paused just inside the door, not as if judging the room, but as if listening to it. "Ms. Carter," he said, "thank you for meeting before opening." "Emily is fine," she said, wiping her hands on a towel. "And this is Rachel Morgan, my operations manager, emergency therapist, and occasional reason the health inspector likes us." Rachel gave a small salute. Nathan smiled. Every strong business has one of those. He did not ask for coffee first. He asked to see the kitchen. That alone told Emily he was serious. She walked him through the back room, showing him the double ovens, the aging mixer, the proofing racks, the handwritten production schedule taped beside the pantry door. She expected him to comment on what was missing. Instead, he asked what was working. Emily showed him the honey sourdough process, the local supplier list, the spreadsheet tracking repeat orders, the wholesale inquiries she had turned down from 3 hotels and 2 specialty grocery stores. Nathan listened, took notes, and never interrupted to explain her own business to her. By 5:40, Rachel had poured coffee for all 3 of them, and they sat at the largest table near the front window while Dawn began turning the glass gold. Nathan opened his notebook. "I reviewed your numbers," he said. "You do not have a bakery problem. You have a capacity problem." Emily held her cup with both hands. "Capacity can be solved by money." "Sometimes," Nathan said. "Bad money creates a worse problem." The sentence landed cleanly, almost painfully. Emily looked at him then, really looked, searching for the hook beneath the kindness. "What would you want?" she asked. "A minority stake," he said. "No control of recipes. No control of brand voice. No right to force a sale. Funding for equipment, staff, legal protection, and a second production kitchen within 10 miles. You keep final authority on product and operations." Rachel went very still beside her. Emily did not speak. Outside, the first customer of the morning appeared near the door, saw the closed sign, and waited patiently with his hands in his coat pockets. Nathan glanced toward him and then back at her. "That," he said quietly, is the part most investors cannot manufacture. Emily followed his gaze. The man outside was Mr. Hanley, who bought 2 rolls every Monday for his wife because she liked them warm after her dialysis appointment. He was not a metric on a pitch deck. He was a person who had trusted her small shop with a tiny piece of his routine. Emily looked down at Nathan's draft terms, then at the flowers still caught beneath her fingernails. For the first time, growth did not look like losing herself. It looked like building walls strong enough to protect what had already begun. Emily did not sign anything that morning, which surprised Nathan only enough to make him respect her more. Instead, she asked for copies of every term sheet, every projection, every clause that contained the words option, approval, transfer, or default. She asked whether his firm had ever forced a founder out. She asked how disputes were handled, who chose the accountant, whether supplier contracts would remain local, and what would happen if the golden crust expanded slower than expected. Each question came out steadier than the last, and with every answer, Emily felt a strange, clean anger rising inside her, not at Nathan, but at the years she had spent believing money was a language spoken by other people in rooms where she did not belong. Daniel had loved that version of the world. He had built whole hallways inside their marriage where only his voice echoed. Now, across a bakery table still dusted with flour, Emily was learning that a contract was not magic. It was not a spell cast by rich men in tailored jackets. It was words on paper, and words could be read. Rachel sat beside her with a yellow legal pad, writing notes so fast her pen nearly gave up its will to live. At 6, Emily unlocked the front door, and the morning customers began drifting in with the sleepy loyalty of people who knew exactly what they wanted before they had coffee. Mr. Hanley bought his 2 rolls and nodded politely at Nathan, who stepped out of the way without trying to become the center of the room. A nurse from MUSC picked up a box of cranberry orange scones for her unit. 2 construction workers ordered black coffee and breakfast buns, paying in cash and calling Emily ma'am in the sincere Southern way that made her feel both respected and approximately 100 years old. Nathan watched quietly. He did not stare at the register numbers with hunger. He watched the customers say her name. He watched Rachel remember who needed oat milk and who hated raisins with the force of a constitutional principle. He watched Emily replace a broken pastry for a teenager who had dropped it outside, no charge, because the girl looked like she had already lost a battle with her morning. By 7:30, the case was half empty, and Nathan closed his notebook. "You have something most chains spend millions trying to imitate," he said. Emily slid a tray of rolls into the case. "What is that?" "Trust." The word should have sounded soft, sentimental, the kind of thing consultants put in slide decks before charging insulting amounts of money. Instead, it hit Emily with the weight of a fact. Trust had been the first ingredient Daniel had wasted. He had treated it like an unlimited supply because for years she had kept giving it to him, measuring out faith in cups and tablespoons until one day the bowl was empty. After Nathan left, promising to send revised documents to an attorney of Emily's choosing, Rachel locked the office door behind them and leaned against it as if the room had survived a small weather event. "You just questioned an investor like he was trying to sneak raisins into my cinnamon rolls," she said. Emily laughed, but her hands were trembling as she untied her apron. "I almost threw up twice. You sounded terrifyingly competent." "That was fear wearing business shoes." Rachel pointed her pen at her. "Good. Let fear dress up. It has been unemployed too long." Emily went quiet, looking through the office window toward the front of the shop. The bakery was alive with ordinary sounds, spoons against mugs, the paper rustle of pastry bags, someone laughing near the window. Nothing about it looked like revenge. There were no dramatic speeches, no shattered chandeliers, no room full of enemies forced to applaud. And yet, in the private courtroom of Emily's heart, something had shifted. Daniel had once told her she was not built for pressure. He had said it gently, as if kindness could disguise the insult. He had been wrong. Pressure had not broken her. It had fermented her patience, sharpened her instincts, and taught her to recognize the difference between a lifeline and a leash. That afternoon, after the lunch rush, Emily called an attorney recommended by Mrs. Alvarez, whose mystery book club apparently contained more retired professionals than the FBI. The attorney's name was Linda Park, and she agreed to review the documents by Friday. When Emily hung up, she wrote one more line beneath ownership, control, and protection, never sign from fear. Outside, traffic moved slowly along the warm Charleston street. Inside, another batch of dough began to rise. Friday came with rain, the kind that softened the edges of Charleston and made the bakery windows blur into silver. By noon, the golden crust felt like a shelter from a weather report no one had asked for, warm. With oven heat and crowded with damp umbrellas, fogged glasses, and customers pretending they had come in only for coffee when everyone knew the lemon cream buns were the real emergency. Emily moved through the rush with a steadiness she had not possessed a week earlier. Something about having Linda Park review the investment documents had changed the shape of fear in her mind. Fear was still there, naturally, because human brains are apparently loyal to every bad thing that ever happened to them. But now it had paperwork, questions, and a woman with 22 years of contract law experience standing between it and the future. Linda had called that morning at 8:15, her voice crisp and reassuring in the way only a good attorney could make expensive news sound like a public service. "The structure is unusually founder-friendly," she had said. "There are changes I want, but nothing predatory. Whoever drafted this understands that your control is part of the value." Emily had gripped the phone so tightly that Rachel had quietly taken a mug from her other hand before it became a casualty. "Your control is part of the value." The sentence stayed with Emily all day, tucked beneath the rhythm of orders and timers. Control had once been something Daniel took by making decisions before she knew there was a choice. Now it was something a lawyer could name, protect, and write into a contract. Near 3 o'clock, when the rain had slowed to a fine mist, the front door opened and Mrs. Alvarez entered with a folded newspaper tucked under her arm and the expression of a woman carrying gossip with civic responsibility. "You may want to see this," she said. Emily wiped her hands and took the paper. It was the Charleston Business Ledger, a publication Daniel had treated like scripture during their marriage whenever his name appeared in it. On the local commerce page, beneath a headline about upcoming small business grants, was a short feature on the golden crust. There was a photograph of Emily standing behind the counter, hair pinned loosely, apron dusted with flour, one hand resting on a tray of honey sourdough. The article mentioned her viral growth, her loyal customer base, and the rumor that multiple hospitality investors were watching her expansion plans. Rachel leaned over her shoulder and read the first paragraph aloud in a dramatic announcer voice until Emily swatted her with a towel. It should have felt thrilling. It did, partly. But under the thrill was an old instinct, the quiet warning that visibility invited judgment. When she had been married to Daniel, public praise had belonged to him. Her role had been to smile beside it, polished and silent, a tasteful accessory with good posture. Seeing her own name in print felt less like applause and more like stepping onto a bridge she had built while blindfolded. The phone rang before she could finish reading. Rachel answered at the counter, then covered the receiver with her palm. "It is Daniel." The bakery noise seemed to pull back. Emily looked at the newspaper, then at the rain shining on the sidewalk outside. "Put him through." Rachel's eyebrows climbed, but she transferred the call to the office. Emily closed the door behind her and picked up the phone. Daniel did not bother with hello. "You should have told me you were talking to investors." Emily looked at the wall where her legal pad still hung. The words ownership, control, protection, never signed from fear underlined twice. "I was not aware my business schedule required your approval." "Do not be childish," he said, the old irritation slipping through. "Food brands are complicated. Capital is complicated. You could get taken advantage of." The concern might have worked once. It wore the old costume well enough. But Emily could hear the seam lines now. "That is why I have an attorney." There was a pause, brief but deliciously human. "An attorney?" "Yes, Daniel. They sell those to women now." Silence followed, and Emily allowed herself one small smile where he could not see it. Then his voice cooled. "I am trying to help you. If these investors are circling, I can make introductions. Real ones. People who understand scale." Emily glanced through the tiny office window toward the front of the shop, where Mr. Hanley was holding the door for a young mother with a stroller and Rachel was laughing at something Mrs. Alvarez had said. "You came into my bakery and called my work survival," she said. "Now that other people see value in it, you want to be useful." "Emily." "No," she said, softly enough that the word did not need volume. "You do not get to arrive after the bread has risen and call yourself part of the recipe." On the other end, Daniel inhaled sharply. For once, He had no polished answer ready. Emily ended the call before he found one. For 3 seconds after Emily ended the call, the office was so quiet she could hear rainwater ticking against the metal awning outside. Then her own heartbeat arrived in her ears, late and dramatic, as if it had been waiting for Daniel to leave before filing a complaint. She set the receiver down carefully, because slamming things had never been her style, and because the phone was old enough to deserve a peaceful retirement. Through the office window, Rachel watched her with the expression of someone trying very hard not to burst through the door, carrying questions like party favors. Emily opened it before Rachel could knock. "He wants to help," Emily said. Rachel's face performed an entire legal argument in silence. "That man thinks helping is standing near a fire and taking credit for warmth." Emily almost smiled, but the tremor in her hands had not fully gone away. She walked to the sink, rinsed flour from her fingers, and let the cold water steady her. Daniel's voice had pulled open a drawer inside her mind she preferred to keep shut. In that drawer were dinner parties where he corrected her stories before she finished them, bank statements he folded away when she entered the room, and the afternoon he told her that passion was lovely, but not the same as capability. She had believed him for far too long. Belief, she had learned, could become a room with no windows if the wrong person kept handing you the furniture. By 4 o'clock, the rain had stopped and the sidewalk outside shone like polished slate. The bakery had settled into its late afternoon hush, that soft hour between the lunch crowd and the people who came in after work pretending they were buying dessert for someone else. Emily was updating the wholesale inquiry spreadsheet when a black SUV pulled up across the street. Rachel noticed it first, because Rachel noticed everything except her own need for sleep. "Please tell me that is not him," she said. Emily looked up. Daniel stepped out wearing a charcoal overcoat, his phone in one hand, his confidence arranged around him like expensive armor. Vanessa was not with him this time. Somehow that made it worse. He crossed the street without hurrying, the way he used to enter charity events when he knew photographers were nearby. The bell rang. A few customers glanced up. Daniel removed his gloves and looked around the bakery with a new expression, not mockery exactly, but assessment. Emily knew that look. He had worn it when touring houses they could not afford, when evaluating employees he planned to replace, when deciding whether a person was useful enough to keep close. "Emily," he said, "I thought we should speak in person." Rachel moved closer to the counter, her smile bright enough to be considered a warning sign in most states. Emily came out from the back with a tray of oatmeal maple cookies and placed it in the display case before answering. "I am working. This will only take a minute." That is usually what people say before wasting 10. A man at the corner table coughed into his napkin. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he reached into his coat and pulled out a slim folder. He placed it on the counter with the controlled gentleness of someone laying down a trap and hoping it looked like a gift. "I spoke with a few contacts after our call," he said. "There may be a cleaner path for you than taking outside capital from strangers." Emily did not touch the folder. "You spoke with contacts about my company without permission." "I spoke broadly," he said. "Do not make it sound sinister." "Then stop making it sound familiar." His eyes flickered. Rachel went still beside the espresso machine. The customers could sense the shape of something happening, the way people in public places always pretend not to listen while absorbing every syllable with the dedication of federal archivists. Daniel lowered his voice. "I can arrange an acquisition offer. Generous, considering the size of the operation. You would walk away with cash, no risk, no debt, no headache. Someone experienced would take it from here." There it was, dressed in better shoes, but smelling exactly the same. The old bargain. Be grateful. Be quiet. Trade ownership for safety. Let a man explain the value of what she had made only after he found a way to own it. Emily looked at the folder, then at the case full of cookies cooling under the glass, each one baked from a recipe she had tested 11 times because Daniel had once said she lacked discipline. "How generous?" Rachel asked, not because she cared, but because curiosity is the unpaid intern of revenge. Daniel named a number. It was not small. 2 years ago, Emily might have sat down from the shock of it. Today, she knew enough to hear what it really was, a discount-wearing perfume. She smiled politely. That would not cover projected revenue for the next 18 months. Daniel blinked. Projected by whom? My accountant, my attorney, and the investors you did not know were already competing. The bakery seemed to hold its breath. Daniel's confidence did not collapse all at once. It thinned, layer by layer, like sugar dissolving in hot coffee. Emily pushed the folder back across the counter without opening it. "You should take this with you," she said. "It might be useful for someone who still thinks I am for sale." Daniel stared at the folder as if Emily had pushed back something far heavier than paper. For a moment, the bakery existed in a silence so complete that even the espresso machine seemed to reconsider its purpose. Then Rachel reached for the tongs and began rearranging oatmeal maple cookies with unnecessary precision, because apparently civilization survives through tiny acts of pastry management. Daniel did not take the folder right away. His eyes moved from Emily's face to the customers pretending not to listen, then to the newspaper clipping Mrs. Alvarez had left on the counter, then back to the display case where the last of the afternoon pastries sat under glass like quiet evidence. "You are making a mistake," he said. His voice was lower now, stripped of charm, carrying the tightness Emily remembered. From the end of their marriage, when every disagreement became a test he expected her to fail. "No," Emily said. "I am making a decision. You are just not in charge of it." The words came out calm, but they cost her something. Not fear exactly. More like the final payment on an old debt she had been carrying in her chest. Daniel's gaze sharpened. "You think a few good months and some flattering attention make you ready for this kind of move? Growth destroys people who do not understand scale." Emily almost laughed, not because it was amusing, but because the sentence sounded so much like him that it belonged in a museum exhibit titled "Men Explaining Elevators While Standing in the Basement." "Then it is fortunate I am learning," she said, "from people who do not need me to feel small before they offer advice." A flush rose along Daniel's neck. It was subtle, but Emily had spent years reading the weather of that face. Anger for him never arrived loudly at first. It came dressed as concern, then disappointment, then authority. She had mistaken all three for love once. Vanessa had not come with him, and without her polished little laugh to soften his edges, Daniel looked older than he had that morning. Not ruined, not tragic, just smaller. A man standing inside a place he had dismissed, realizing the walls had gone up without asking his permission. Rachel slid a cookie into a paper sleeve and handed it to the teenage girl at the counter. "On the house," she said, her eyes still fixed on Daniel. "Educational discount." The girl fled with the speed of someone who had received both dessert and gossip. Daniel finally picked up the folder. "You will regret embarrassing me." Emily's hand rested lightly on the counter. The wood was warm from the sun that had returned after the rain. "I did not embarrass you. I told you no in public. If that feels the same, you might want to sit with it." Mrs. Alvarez made a small sound near the bookshelves by the front window, halfway between a cough and a blessing. Daniel looked toward her, then toward the rest of the room. He seemed to understand then that there would be no private corner here, no version of the story he could trim and polish before anyone else heard it. The bakery had witnesses. Worse for him, the bakery had people who liked Emily before they knew she was becoming valuable. That kind of loyalty could not be bought after the fact, and Daniel had always been better at acquisition than earning. He tucked the folder beneath his arm and leaned closer, lowering his voice so only Emily and Rachel could hear. "Those investors are not your friends." Emily nodded once. "That is why they will have contracts." "And you think that protects you?" "No," she said. "I think reading them does." Something in his face changed at that. The old Emily would never have said it. The old Emily would have trusted the tone, not the terms. She would have accepted the folder because Daniel looked certain, and certainty had once seemed like intelligence to her. Now it only looked like good posture with a credit score. The bell above the door rang as Daniel turned to leave, but before he stepped outside, Nathan Brooks walked in carrying a plain cardboard sample box and wearing a raincoat darkened at the shoulders. He stopped when he saw Daniel. Daniel stopped too. The two men recognized each other in the strange, immediate way businessmen do, as if scenting a boardroom from 50 feet away. Nathan's expression remained polite. Daniel's did not. "Brooks," Daniel said. "I should have known." Nathan glanced at Emily, then at the folder under Daniel's arm, and understood enough not to ask the obvious question humans ask when they want everyone to suffer longer. "Daniel," he said, "I did not realize you were a customer." Rachel looked down at the counter, visibly fighting for her life. Emily felt the smallest smile touch her mouth. Daniel's fingers tightened around the folder. "I am not." Nathan nodded. Then I suppose Emily has already handled it. The sentence was quiet, almost gentle, but it landed with more force than any insult could have. Emily had handled it. Not been saved. Not been rescued. Not been explained into safety. Handled it. Daniel looked at her one last time, and for once there was no easy smirk waiting in reserve. Only the dawning, uncomfortable knowledge that he had arrived too late to find the woman standing behind the counter. He left without another word, the bell ringing after him like a small, bright verdict. Nathan did not step farther into the bakery until Daniel was gone. He stood near the door for a moment, rain shining on his coat, watching through the front window as Daniel crossed the street with the folder tucked beneath his arm in a posture too rigid to be casual. Outside, Charleston had begun glowing again after the storm, the wet pavement catching the late afternoon light in bright silver patches. Inside, the bakery slowly remembered how to breathe. A customer stirred her coffee. Someone near the window whispered, "Well, that was awkward," with the hushed reverence usually reserved for church and hospital waiting rooms. Rachel set both hands flat on the counter and looked at Nathan. "Please tell me your sample box contains either legal documents or emotional support pastries." Nathan lifted the cardboard box slightly. "Both, depending on how you feel about laminated dough." Rachel nodded. "Acceptable." Emily tried to laugh, but the feeling caught somewhere in her throat. The confrontation had ended cleanly, almost elegantly, and yet her body had not received the memo. Her hands felt light and cold. Her knees carried the strange weakness that arrives after a person finally says what they should have said years ago. Nathan noticed without making a spectacle of it, which Emily appreciated more than any grand display of concern. "We can do this another time," he said. Croissant from a bakery in Savannah Nathan had invested in 7 years earlier. "This," he said, placing the croissant on a napkin, "is what happens when expansion respects the original product." Rachel leaned in. "If this is a metaphor, I support it only if we get to eat the evidence." Nathan smiled and broke the croissant in half. It shattered lightly, golden flakes scattering across the table like edible confetti thrown by very tasteful accountants. Emily took a bite and hated how good it was, because apparently capitalism occasionally produced pastry miracles just to keep everyone morally confused. Nathan walked her through the revised terms slowly. Linda Park's requested changes had been accepted almost entirely. Emily would keep 68% ownership after the investment. She would retain final approval over recipes, suppliers, hiring for executive kitchen roles, and brand identity. No forced sale. No recipe transfer. No national franchising without her written approval. Funding would cover a new deck oven, a commercial mixer, 2 additional bakers, legal filings, packaging design, and the lease on a production kitchen no more than 8 miles from the original shop. The numbers were large enough to make Emily's stomach tighten, but not so large that they erased the room around her. That mattered. Daniel had always spoken about growth as if it required leaving everything human behind. Bigger house, better car, cleaner image, more impressive friends. He had confused expansion with escape. Shoulder with the intensity of a border agent, tapped one clause. "We need Linda to check this line again." Emily nodded. "We will send it tonight." Nathan gathered the papers with no sign of impatience. "Take your time." Outside, a black SUV pulled away from the curb. Emily did not need to see the driver to know Daniel had waited, hoping for some last glimpse of uncertainty he could use to comfort himself. She gave him none. Afternoon, tucked between a supplier invoice and a wholesale inquiry from a boutique hotel on Kiowa Island. Charleston Women Founders Showcase, the subject line read. Emily almost deleted it, assuming it was a newsletter, until Rachel leaned over and made a sound normally reserved for lottery numbers and celebrity arrests. "You have been nominated for the Emerging Founder Panel," Rachel said. Emily stared at the screen. The event was in 2 weeks at the restored Exchange Hall downtown, a room with marble floors, high windows, and enough chandeliers to make every small business owner feel underdressed and underfunded. Investors, local press, restaurant groups, and regional buyers would attend. Nathan had not submitted her name. Linda had not either. The nomination had come from 3 local business owners, including Mrs. Alvarez, who apparently had been running a quiet public relations campaign between mystery novels and biscotti. Emily read the email twice. "Speak for 7 minutes about your founder journey. Present your growth plan." Participate in investor networking. 7 minutes. She had once spent 7 years married to a man who made her nervous about ordering wine at dinner, and now strangers wanted her to stand on a stage and explain a company she had built from flour, exhaustion, and refusal. Her first instinct was to say no, not because she lacked a story, but because telling it publicly meant accepting that it mattered. Daniel had always made her pain feel embarrassing, something private people should fold neatly and store out of view. But the golden crust had not grown from silence alone. It had grown because customers saw something in it. Warmth, resilience, proof that starting over did not have to look impressive at first to be real. Rachel watched her face and softened. "You do not have to bleed on stage," she said. "Just tell the truth with good lighting." Emily laughed under her breath, then looked toward the front of the shop. Mr. Hanley was at his usual table, splitting a roll carefully into 2 pieces, saving one for his wife. A college student was photographing a pastry beside her laptop. A little girl pressed her nose to the glass case as if the blueberry hand pies contained state secrets. This was not just a bakery anymore, though maybe it never had been. It was a place where people returned because something about it kept its promises. Emily clicked reply before fear could draft a more persuasive argument. She accepted the invitation. That evening, after closing, she stood alone in the kitchen with the lights low and practiced saying her name out loud, followed by the word founder. The first time, it sounded borrowed. The second time, it sounded possible. By the third, it sounded like hers. 2 weeks later, Exchange Hall looked nothing like the Golden Crust, though both places had required someone to arrive early, check the lights, and pray the plumbing held. The restored downtown building rose behind iron gates and polished stone, its tall windows glowing against the evening blue, its marble floors reflecting chandeliers so bright they made every name tag look like it belonged to someone richer than the person wearing it. Emily stood near a side table with Rachel, holding a glass of ice water she had no intention of drinking because her stomach had become a small, anxious committee. She wore a navy dress Linda Park had described as competent with excellent tailoring, which was perhaps the highest compliment an attorney could legally give clothing. Her hair was pinned back simply. Her only jewelry was a thin gold bracelet that had belonged to her grandmother, the same woman whose handwritten biscuit recipe had taught Emily that patience could be measured in teaspoons. Across the hall, founders moved in careful circles with investors, buyers, city officials, and reporters. There were women who owned software companies, medical supply firms, design studios, childcare networks, catering businesses, and construction services. Some wore suits. Some wore dresses. One woman wore cowboy boots under a black blazer and looked like she could negotiate a bank loan while fixing a tractor. Emily found that comforting. Nathan arrived quietly, speaking with Linda near the registration table before coming over. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Like I swallowed a receipt printer," Emily said. Rachel nodded. "That is medically accurate." Nathan smiled, then glanced past Emily's shoulder, and the smile faded by 1 careful degree. Emily knew before she turned. Daniel had entered with Vanessa on his arm. He wore a dark suit and the composed expression of a man trying to look invited by destiny rather than networking desperation. Vanessa looked beautiful in a pale silver dress, but her eyes moved around the room with the restless calculation of someone trying to determine where the cameras were and whether she was standing near enough to influence. Daniel saw Emily almost immediately. For 1 heartbeat, his face held the same disbelief he had shown in the bakery when she refused his offer. Then he adjusted it into amusement. He said something to the man beside him, and both of them looked in Emily's direction. Rachel leaned close. "Do not throw water. It is not worth wasting clean ice." Emily breathed through her nose, slowly. Daniel being here should not have surprised her. Charleston's business world was not large enough for gossip to stretch its legs. If investors were coming, Daniel would come too, drawn by the possibility that someone else's momentum might still be turned into his leverage. But this time, the room did not belong to him. His voice was not the loudest. His name was not on the program. Hers was. A volunteer wearing a headset approached with a clipboard and a kind smile. "Ms. Carter, we are ready for the emerging founder panel in 5 minutes." Emily looked down at the printed schedule. There it was in black ink. Emily Carter, founder, the Golden Crust. Not Mrs. Whitman. Not Daniel's ex-wife. Not the woman who had lost the house. Founder. The word no longer sounded borrowed. It had weight now, shape, a place to stand. Linda touched her elbow lightly. Remember, 7 minutes. Speak plainly. Do not rush. You know your numbers. Rachel added. And if you forget everything, just describe the honey sourdough. Half this room would fund a napkin if it smelled like that. Emily laughed, and the knot in her chest loosened enough for air to pass through. When her name was called, she walked toward the stage beneath the chandeliers, aware of Daniel watching. From near the back, aware of Nathan beside the front row, aware of Rachel gripping her phone like a weapon of emotional documentation. The microphone stood at the center of the platform. Beyond it were rows of faces, curious, polished, distracted, hopeful. Emily placed her notes on the lectern, but she did not look at them first. She looked at her hands. No flour tonight. No burns from oven racks. No ink smudges from order labels. Still, they were the same hands. They had folded dough at 4:30 in the morning, signed payroll checks, scrubbed counters, answered investor calls, and pushed Daniel's folder back across the counter unopened. She lifted her eyes to the room. I started my business with 1 rented oven, 5 recipes, and a belief I was not sure I had earned yet, she said. But customers came back before confidence did. The room quieted. Emily felt the fear beside her, familiar as an old neighbor, but it no longer owned the house. Emily had practiced those first lines at least 30 times in the bakery kitchen, between the mixer and the sink, with Rachel timing her on a phone and interrupting whenever she started sounding like a brochure written by a committee that hated feelings. Still, nothing about practice had prepared her for the quiet that followed her opening sentence. It was not empty quiet. It was listening quiet, the kind that makes a person realize her voice has traveled farther than she expected and now has to become brave enough to meet itself at the other end. Emily glanced once at her notes, then set them aside. When I opened the golden crust, I thought I was starting with almost nothing, she continued. 1 rented oven, 600 square feet, a second-hand mixer that made a noise like it was personally offended by butter. I had 5 recipes, a lease I was not sure I should have signed, and enough fear to keep me awake most nights. A soft ripple of laughter moved through the room, gentle and real. Emily let it pass, then went on. But I also had customers who came back. Not because we were perfect. We were not. In the first month, I burned $200 worth of almond croissants, mislabeled 3 catering orders, and once forgot to unlock the front door until a retired English teacher knocked on the glass and asked whether capitalism had been postponed. Near the back, Mrs. Alvarez lifted her chin with regal pride, as if this were now part of the historical record, which unfortunately for everyone, it was. Emily smiled, and the room warmed with her. What I learned was that growth does not begin when investors notice you. It begins when people trust you enough to return. Her eyes moved across the audience and found Daniel. He stood near a marble column, Vanessa beside him, his expression carefully blank. But Emily knew him too well to mistake blankness for peace. He had expected her to tremble. Maybe he had expected her to thank people like him without naming them, to tell the kind of story where a woman survives politely enough that no one has to feel uncomfortable about who made survival necessary. She would not give him that. She did not need to accuse him to free herself from him. That was the strange mercy of truth when spoken clearly. It did not have to point. It simply stood up. For a long time, she said, I confused being underestimated with being unqualified. There is a difference. Being underestimated is someone else's poor measurement. Being unqualified means you refuse to learn. I learned. I learned food costs, payroll, licensing, supplier contracts, customer retention, trademark filings, and the very humbling reality that a commercial oven costs more than some used cars. More laughter came, stronger this time. Rachel pressed one hand to her heart from the front row, her phone still recording. Nathan watched without smiling too broadly, the way decent people sometimes do when they are trying not to claim a moment that is not theirs. Emily picked up the clicker and brought the first slide onto the screen behind her. The golden crust, year 1 revenue, repeat customer rate, wholesale demand. Numbers appeared in clean columns. No dramatic music. No spotlight turning her into someone else. Just evidence. We are currently operating at full capacity 5 days a week, she said. Online orders have grown 340% in the last quarter. Our repeat customer rate is 62%. We have declined 7 wholesale accounts because saying yes before you are ready is not ambition. It is a very expensive way to disappoint people. Several founders in the audience nodded. Emily saw Linda Park smile slightly, which from Linda was basically fireworks. Our next step is not to become everywhere, Emily said. It is to become stronger. A second production kitchen within 8 miles of the original bakery. Local suppliers protected. Recipes owned by the company I founded. Staff hired with benefits before expansion demands their exhaustion. Growth capital structured so that control stays with the person responsible for the promise customers already trust. The room had gone still again, but this time Emily did not fear it. She could feel the structure beneath her words, like a table built well enough to hold weight. This was not a speech about revenge. It was a business plan with a heartbeat. She looked once more toward Daniel, not to wound him, not to win, but to mark the distance traveled. His gaze dropped first. It was small, almost invisible, yet Emily felt it like a door closing behind her without a lock. She turned back to the room. The golden crust began as a place to start over, she said. Now it is becoming proof that small businesses are not small because they lack value. Sometimes they are small because they are still protecting what makes them worth growing. When she finished, the applause did not explode all at once. It rose, gathering from the front rows, then the back, then the corners of the hall until it filled the marble room with a sound that made Emily's throat tighten. She stepped back from the microphone, not as Daniel's ex-wife, not as the woman who had been left with the crumbs, but as the founder of something warm, stubborn, and entirely hers.